The property and general liability insurances, those programs are with the new broker, and they are out to bid, and the new broker is marketing those programs. Jackie got a call on Friday from an insurance company that wants to come in and actually go through the district before they give their bid. So there is interest out there on our property and general liability insurance program. So that's good news. Also, we have the medical, prescription, and stop loss rates for next year. Mr. Allen is continuing to work on them. He will be here on Wednesday night as part of Mrs. McHale's meeting to give you an update on the status of our insurance programs, and he will share with you some numbers as far as what our history and usage of the programs has been. The other next item is what we just got finished talking about, school bus funding. $850,000 is a number that I spoke with and worked out with Brian. You know, some years, depending on what 10 vehicles that we may need to replace, it might be, you know, $950,000. Some years, like this year, he had some smaller vehicles that he needed to replace, some of the vans that carry the students, and we spent, I believe he said $650,000 or $690,000 this year. So I'm sorry, $650,000. So $850,000 is the recommendation to put into the budget if the board would wish to move forward with the plan to replace the vehicles. The last item on the expenditure side is a budgetary reserve. We don't have a reserve placed within the budget for unexpected problems. Good thing is we do have a capital projects fund, and you know, if something really went wrong, we could use capital project funding. We do have fund balance, which is a positive thing, but placing a budgetary reserve in the general fund budget would allow us to react to some unknown happening that may occur, and then we would have dollars set aside within the budget that we could react to that. Considerations over on the revenue side, basic ed funding and Ready to Learn block grant funding for 15-16. We did finally receive information from the state today. They posted numbers at about 3 o'clock today finally as what the final allocations for 15-16 will be. All state funding line items for 16-17 are unknown. The governor, in his budget address in February, talked about a $200 million increase for basic education funding, but he has talked about a lot of things and a lot of money over the last 12 to 15 months, and not a lot of that's come true. So that's where he's at. We don't know where the legislature is at on 16-17, and I don't think we'll know that anytime in the near future. The other consideration is commitment of fund balance that we already have in place for school bus funding, and a commitment of fund balance for budgetary reserve. Show you here what the actual state numbers look like. The first line, the 14-15 final allocations, we got about $10.2 million. In the governor's methodology, I showed you this slide last week, we would receive about $180,000 more. However, under the basic ed funding formula, I shared with you that we would receive about $494,000, which would be an increase of $313,000. We got the numbers, like I said, late this afternoon from the state. They're about $6,000 higher than what I have here. So our additional funding will be about $319,000 more. So right now, within the budget that I gave you or I showed you, we had placed in $180,000, going with the conservative numbers at that point. But at this point, we can add roughly the $319,000, not new number now, to the general fund budget for the state. The estimate there that I showed you last week or 2 weeks ago, the $441,000 is basically the basic ed funding estimate for 16-17 if the governor does indeed is able to get $200 million additional for state basic ed funding. So that is what the estimated amount for Pennridge School District would be. Okay, so that's where we're at right now. We do have an additional $319,000 in revenue to work into the 16-17 budget that we actually know for sure that we're going to get. Otherwise, it's still up in the air. This is the fund balance situation projected as of the end of 2016. So coming into this fiscal year, we had total fund balances of about $16 million. What we did was we used or committed $295,000 for transportation buses, which we used. We committed $330,000 for non-routine maintenance, which we used, and technology initiatives $250,000. We also had an unbalanced budget coming into this fiscal year, and in order to balance the revenues and expenditures, we had to use about $2.5 million of the other monies that were set aside. So if all revenues that were budgeted in 15-16 come true, and every budgeted expenditure comes true in 15-16, which we know a budget's a budget, it doesn't actually happen that way, but this is what it would look like in the end. Our fund balances would drop, as you see there. So where we're at then, is, at this point, like I said before, a balanced budget. However, that balanced budget does not include anything for the buses, does not include a budgetary reserve, and it does not include the increase in basic ed and Ready to Learn block grant funding that we have now learned from the state that we will receive. So the recommendation at this point is to add the additional dollars into the budget that we need to move forward with a plan to replace the buses and continue to move forward with that plan as we move out into the future. Add the $313,000 into the revenue side from the basic ed funding and the Ready to Learn block grant. That leaves us with $536,593 that we would have to commit fund balance for to purchase the remaining $850,000 worth of buses. Then add $350,000 as a budgetary reserve and $350,000 of a commitment to fund balance for the budgetary reserve. Again, that would not be used unless we had some type of an emergency. It's basically a rainy day fund just in case something happened. And believe me, in a budget of $130 million, $350,000 is not a very big cushion in case something happens. So at this point, they would be my recommendations to move forward to bring you the final budget for passage in the final proposed budget for passage in May, and then the final passage in June. Now, none of these changes are in the budget, but this is what my recommendation is that we would do. So I would course, not do any of this unless the board wished us to move in this direction.
I have a question. Okay. Yeah, so the committing fund balance for a budgetary reserve, I mean, isn't the fund balance isn't that basically the unassigned, isn't that the rainy day fund, isn't that what that's for? And then it seems like we're taking, I mean, I understand when you commit it, you're saying that's what it's for, and then, I mean, I guess the difference between letting it sit there in the fund balance and then committing it as a budgetary reserve, would that just mean that the administration, if there's an issue that it's going over budget, you wouldn't have to come to the board? I'm just wondering why we need to commit that fund if it's all there as a just in case.
Because technically by law in Pennsylvania, it's illegal to overspend your budget. So if you spent the entire budget and then you had some issue that you needed extra dollars for, you can't, you basically cannot spend more than that budget unless you can expand it for some other program, like a federal program, some grant or something that the state gives you after you do your budget. But basically, you have to stay within that expenditure side of the budget and not overexpend it. So in order to, yes, and the other part of your question is, yes, you do have fund balance reserve, and that is what it is for. It is for that rainy day fund. But in order to use that as a revenue source and spend those dollars, you have to include that in the general fund expenditure side in order to do that. Or if you don't, you're overexpending your budget.
And if we do commit that fund balance for the budgetary reserve, if we get into that situation and we need to spend it, would that come as a special, would the board have to vote on it specifically, or would it just be a transfer that comes through in those monthly documents? How would we see it?
You would see it as a budget transfer from the budgetary reserve account to an expenditure line item.
I'm confused. Haven't we overspent it in the past? So how is it that we've overspent and pulled from fund balance in the past without it being in a budgetary reserve, but now we can't?
We haven't overexpended the budget in the past. What we've done is we've not had as much revenue in the budget that we had expenditures.
But I thought we pulled from fund balance before to pay for major expenses.
To balance, basically the fund balance was used to balance the budget. The dollars were in on the expenditure side, but there wasn't enough revenue within the revenue accounts to balance that, so it has to come from the fund balance. But no, we would not have overexpended the budget.
So is the capital projects fund, how is that different from, so are all the monies in there, they're not assigned to certain things, it's just for improvements to capital? How is it different from this reserve you're talking about? Like, could you give me an example of what you would use the capital fund for that you wouldn't use for the rainy day fund? I don't know if I'm asking.
No, that's a good question. The capital projects fund in itself is a separate legal fund, separate from the general fund. So the general fund has within it its own basic savings account, which basically is the fund balance reserve. And in order to spend those dollars, they have to flow through the general fund. The capital projects fund is over here in its own, and it does also have commitments within it for dollars to be used for certain things. And the board, Jeff brings you a plan every year in October or November for that next summer's capital projects fund. And then we will plan for those projects. Jeff will put them out to bid. Mike will come in, go over the bids, go through those projects with you, and then those dollars will be spent out of that capital projects fund. Now, how does that?
Please, sir.
Sorry. You made me lose my train of thought there, Mrs. Furlong.
Pardon me?
You made me lose my train of thought.
I'm sorry.
That's all right.
Turn the microphone on at the beginning and that won't happen.
I think it was on, it went off on me.
I know, it does it to me too.
So anyways, Jeff will bring those projects in, we'll go through those projects, pay for them out of the separate capital projects fund. So how do the dollars get to the capital projects fund? That can happen in a number of different ways. You can borrow, you can do a bond issue and borrow funds to fund your capital project fund. You can plan for those within the general fund budget and then actually transfer those dollars over to capital projects fund. At the end of the year, if you have a surplus of revenues over expenditures and you haven't spent the entire budget, you can actually do a line item transfer of those unspent funds and put those dollars over into capital projects. And so they're there then for those projects as you move forward. So that's how the dollars get there. And then Jeff actually has a 7-year rolling capital projects plan that he has come up with over the years with Mike and with Dewey, folks from Dewey. And each year we update that plan and we bring those projects to the board. We were at the end of the 14-15 year, we actually were able to put some dollars over into the capital projects fund. And we have those there, and we won't have to go back to the bond market and borrow money and incur more debt, at least for the foreseeable future. So.
I'm sorry, can you just explain to me, if we have $7 million in the unassigned fund, you're saying that if there's some emergency, we can't use it because we'd be going over budget anyway. So then why do we have it in there if we can't use it?
You have to you have to actually budget for the use of those dollars, and it's, I don't know that I have a good answer for you other than those are the governmental accounting rules that we have to follow. You can't just tap into those dollars without, you can't overexpend your budget. You come to a set amount of budget, say it's $132 million. So throughout that fiscal year, that's what your limit is on the expenditure side. Whatever comes in as far as revenues, you may get $135 million in revenues. But you can't go over that amount on your expenditure side unless you have some reason or some allowable within the accounting code that allows you to expand your budget. And that's generally a new program or something like that. So if you don't have that, then that extra $5 million or whatever it is has to go into your fund balance reserve. And then you have to plan for that in a budget and budget to use those dollars. It's there's some method to the madness there because it actually makes you plan for that and budget for that instead of just just spending all those dollars. So there has to be a planning process. There has to be a budgeting process. So look at it from the other side. Your budget's $130 million. Something happens on the revenue side where you only get $128 million in, but you spend $130 million. The $2 million comes from the fund balance. The fund balance goes down when you take $2 million out of your savings account because you didn't get those dollars in the revenue side, but you spent them because you spent your budget on it of $130 million. So then it reduces the fund balance.
Okay, thank you. It just seems like we have a big safety net that we can't use, and so it kind of seems counterproductive, but I get your point. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I think our neighbors to the northwest are an obvious cautionary tale on just this subject. You look at them and they have not believed in carrying a fund balance, and they were in trouble facing the state impasse on the budget. And now they face something on the order of $110 million worth of renovations, all of which they don't have the resources short of borrowing to do. I think the budgeting here has been very different, and the use of fund balance has been essentially non-existent in budgets until the last 4 years. I'm very glad to see this one doesn't require that. And I think the fact that next year's budget is so uncertain as well, I mean, if you talk to people in the legislature, they make it seem like it could be worse, if anything, than this year. So I think we need to have a cushion, and it is something that is very worthwhile. If it's something that doesn't get used, that's good. If it does get used, we have it to use. We would have survived this year. Many school districts survived, but they survived with much greater costs. They had to borrow money, or they were just plain short.
Right, I guess we're in a different position because we don't get as much money from the state and federal government, so we don't need as much, we don't depend on that money as much as these other districts do, you know?
Right. We've also saved over the years and transferred that money into capital reserve to do projects. I mean, all the 7 elementary schools that we renovated between 2007 and 2014 were done with dollars that were transferred as opposed to a bond issue.
Right. Right. I mean, the last thing we want to do is borrow dollars for routine capital maintenance type projects. If we're going to borrow dollars and go into debt, we want to do that for a building project, a major renovation or new building down the road if we ever have to do that. What we want to be able to do is fund those routine capital maintenance projects as we go, and do that through a process of transferring unspent dollars or extra revenues over to the capital projects fund and building those dollars there and using them for those costs. And the thing is, you know, as Dr. Ernell said, we have a fund balance in place for a reason. At one point in time, we were down from the state about $7 or $8 million this year. We didn't feel that impact as far as running out of money because we had dollars in reserve to draw on and use those dollars through that process instead of having to go to the bank and borrow money since the state hadn't, like so many other districts had to do. And now they are forced to not only pay back those dollars, they're paying back interest, and the state is not coming through to give any help at this point to those districts as far as borrowing costs and so forth. So some people don't like it, but some people do. It's a necessary evil in order to keep your cash flow going, be able to keep the district rolling in a budgetary season like we just went through with the state, and continue to move forward. So.
Doesn't it also impact our bond rating and let us borrow money for less?
Absolutely. The bond rating companies will look at your fund balance. They'll look at your fund balance over time. They want to see consistency in your fund balance. They don't want to see a huge swing where in 1 year you use 50% of your fund balance to balance your budget. Then as they do their annual evaluations, then you may start to see some impacts on your bond ratings. Your bond rating moves in a negative direction, and when that happens, then when you borrow dollars, you borrow them at more expensive costs. And right now we're not in the market to borrow more money, but in the near future we are going to perhaps be in the market to refund issues. And the lower the interest rate, the more money we save. So.
Okay, so that brings us down to recommended changes to the budget. Thank you, Sean, by the way. So, is everyone in favor of on board with what Sean's recommending here? And remember, we still, after this budget is complete, we still have to come back to our other funds, right?
Yes.
We're leaving that out of here for right now. So we have other monies and funds that we could earmarked for things that may be more important or have a higher priority. So for now, Sean's made some recommended changes, and I'm okay with those changes myself. I like them.
Are these changes for the 16-17 budget? Because it has in here the revenue increasing the 15-16 basic ed.
We're
And
just,
so are we going to increase the 16-17 by the same amount, is that what it's saying?
for the 16-17 budget, what we're budgeting is the numbers that the state just gave us and just told us what our budget is for 15-16. We have not built in anything for a 16-17 increase into the 16-17 budget because we just don't have any idea what that is going to be. We know what the governor asked for in his address in February, but based on what we just went through this year and how long it took them to figure out what they were going to do, I couldn't stand here and recommend a number to you and feel good about it because I just don't have any idea what it's going to be. But yes, hopefully there will be more dollars, state dollars for us in 16-17, but we don't know what they are.
That's not my question. My question is that you're increasing the 2015-16 amount by 300 and, it says 13, but it's 319,000.
Yep.
I'm saying you're also adding that same amount into the 16-17 budget,
Yes,
or no?
yes. Yes,
okay.
that's the first budget that you'll see that increase in, because we didn't know what that increase was for the 15-16 budget when we did that. So
all of these items on page 6 are for the 16-17 budget?
Yes.
Even though it says
Yes.
15-16?
yeah,
Okay.
I apologize for not understanding your question.
Thank you.
Well,
Yes, I'm supporting this budget.
Okay. You guys, everyone's good? Anyone, now's not our last chance, but we're getting close to our last chance. Can you run that past us one more time? Not the whole budget, just this will appear in our May meeting as the final, with your change.
Preliminary.
Is it what's
Preliminary budget.
That it's proposed final
proposed final?
in May, and then it's final in June.
Right, so the next one we vote on is
What
proposed
you
final.
did in January was preliminary.
Preliminary, okay, so now we're up, this month is the proposed final.
So you'll have to vote on a budget in May. There has to be 30 days between your two votes, and it has to be publicly advertised and available for public inspection for 20 days.
Got it. All right, well, thank you, Sean. It looks like that was a good job, thank you.
Thank you.
So that brings us to public comment again. You gonna pass on that? Mr. Linden's out of the room, so he missed his chance. So with that being known and stated out loud, we're adjourned.